Hello, I'm Rick Wingrove. Welcome to Road to Reason.
And I'm Rob Penzak. And today we're joined by Sean Faircloth, author of Attack of the Theocrats, How the Religious Right Harms Us All and What We Can Do About It. Now, Sean, I know you served 5 terms in the Maine Legislature, and you also, as an attorney, you worked with Child Protective Services. How does that life experience inform your writing, and what exactly are you trying to accomplish?
Well, in my service in politics, I saw often that the religious right, even in a state like Maine, was lobbying, working hard every day. There was no one, 0 people, lobbying and working for the secular perspective in all my 10 years. And I served in positions where I should be lobbied. I was 6 years on the Judiciary Committee, which handles marriage equality issues, handles women's reproductive rights, human rights. Then I was on Appropriations Committee, which is the money committee, the most powerful committee. And then I was Majority Whip, which is one of 6 people in leadership. So there was reason to lobby me. Never was I lobbied from a secular perspective. Often was the fundamentalist viewpoint lobbied in the legislature. And then I saw that it was working. That is to say, I really started to research laws that had a religious bias in them, despite the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. And that's what I really document in Chapter 3 of my book, is I just give law after law after law in America today that most people, and I include most secular people, are not even aware of, where there's religious privileging in American law. And then I show people who are hurt by these laws, not ceremonial deism, if you will, but laws where people are really hurt, so that you can bring examples to your neighbor. And then you said about informing my actions now. Well, my goal with this book is really a plan for action. What can we do about it? I wrote about a 10-point vision of a secular America. I just got back from Australia, where they're actually taking the 10-point vision of a secular America and using it as a guiding star for a 10-point vision of a secular Australia. So it's really a method by which we move forward with specifics, rather than debating religion or not religion, but how are we going to change society for the better? So that's really the focus of the book and of my work.
You were in the Maine Legislature for 10 years.
Yes.
And then you were the Executive Director for the Secular Coalition for America.
Yeah.
And now you're the Director of Strategy and Policy for the Richard Dawkins Foundation. The first 2 were obviously focused on legislation. Now, not so much. You're doing other things. What kind of projects are you on now?
Well, I am focused on legislation, certainly the legislation I describe in my book and elsewhere, where there's privileging of law. But the key thing for me, having served as a lobbyist, in addition to 10 years in politics, I served 2 years as the lobbyist for my state bar association, and then I served 2 years as the lobbyist and the executive director for Secular Coalition for America. And I saw a contrast. I mean, it's one that may be uncomfortable, but it's the reality, is when I would walk into a room and say, I'm the lobbyist for the Bar Association, for lawyers, whether you like or dislike them, or whether a politician liked or disliked lawyers, it didn't matter. They listened. They knew that this was a powerful organization that was to be paid heed. They had cash, and they had numbers of people. So numbers of people and numbers of dollars. And I feel like the next big step for secularism, having experienced it directly lobbying myself, is that it's not so much the genius ideas that the lobbyist offers, is it can the lobbyist look the elected official in the eye and say, yes, I'm going to email 10, 20, 30,000 people when I get back about what you have to say. We have people who are contributors. You wouldn't say this exactly expressly in the meeting, but they would be under the understanding that you have an organization that also has financial firepower. So with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, with my book, my focus is really how do we build that movement that has real credibility, just as the gay equality movement did, so that elected officials say, yeah, we are going to respond because we respond to power.
You know, one of the things I saw in a PowerPoint presentation by Edwina Rogers at the American Atheist Conference was that the religious right is outspending the secularists roughly 1,000 to 1, like 380 million to 350,000. And you know, so what do you need to say to us as the secular community? How do we begin to right that balance?
This is a critical challenge, and what I intend to do with my efforts as Director of Strategy and Policy with the Richard Dawkins Foundation is, for me, my book is not a philosophy book. It is a how-to book. It is a take-action book. So it's really for your viewers to say, what can we do specifically? And so I take that 10-point vision, which gives you 10 areas of American law where there's religious bias. And a lot of people are aware of 2 areas right off the top of their head. They know about the marriage equality issue, and that religious bias is why there's a lack of marriage equality. They know about women's reproductive issues and their ability to control their own bodies and how that, again, is thwarted largely by religious bias. But I write about 8 more areas of American law, many of which people are not aware of, which you can use as a rallying cry to gather more people to the cause. Particularly, I begin with the area of children. There are many areas of law in the United States. I'm not talking about Pakistan. I'm talking about in the United States where there's religious bias and where children are disadvantaged and sometimes even harmed physically because of an imprimatur of religious bias in law. So that's step one, is kind of exposing the problem, shining a light on the problem. And then I go into, in the latter parts of the book, here's some strategic planning steps we can take to move forward as a secular movement.
You talk about a number of laws where religion is privileged. I know about 501c3 rules because American Atheists just filed a lawsuit against the IRS. And so they've got that. And then there's the laws which allow churches to basically ignore all zoning and common courtesy. What else?
Well, those are certainly prominent examples. Another area, as I mentioned, is in the area of children's law. I'll just give you a couple of examples. There are about 13 states where child cares that are labeled religious to one degree or another can exempt themselves from the generally applicable health and safety laws that apply to child cares. These are our most vulnerable people, 2- and 3-year-old citizens. And what happens is when you have child staff ratio regulation, when you have food safety, medication safety, training for staff, that's good, and then you have state oversight. In Alabama, an extreme example, is basically exempt from regulation, and there are some very good religious child cares, but unfortunately, and I would say this is true of any system where no one's watching what is happening, and there's no regulation of what's happening, well, lo and behold, you have a higher percentage of children that are placed in situations of ill health or death, including, in some extreme cases that I describe in my book, situations where children have died, where they may well not
Just this week, a family killed their second child by resorting only to prayer.
And that faith healing, the most evil, false phrasing in the world, it's certainly not faith healing, it's faith harming and often faith killing. And that's an even more widespread, unfortunately, example in American law. About 36, 37 states have I'll call it a greater leeway within their child protection law, which I used to do as an assistant attorney general, where they say that in many states the rubric will be, well, unless the child is about to die, then we, the Child Protective Services, will not engage. Whereas with a typical home, a secular home or what have you, if they see a child is significantly sick, they're going to get them right away to the doctor. A tragic case in Pennsylvania about a decade ago, which illustrates this, is there was a boy, child protective workers just trying to do their job. They saw the boy had a hurt foot. Now they said, as we understand these regs, we're not doctors. It doesn't look like the kid's about to die from a hurt foot. They left, said, we'll come back and check later. Unfortunately, and a medical person could have identified this, it turned out to be actually, I think it was lymphoma. It was a symptom of a much, much more serious health issue, but one that was salvageable, where the kid could have survived. Unfortunately, when the child protective workers came back, the child had died. So a real tragedy where it's not just the horrible tragedy of the parents, which is bad enough, neglecting their child's health, but where actually, because of American law, it's making it easier for a child to be placed in situations of ill health or death. And there is zero constitutional right for this. It is all bias in law passed by lobbying, unjust lobbying.
And I think we've seen what deregulation has done to the financial industry and all the harm that's caused. And one of the very touching things that your book does is you really personalize this, and it's not just an abstraction anymore. You go through a bunch of cases where these are individual kids that died or suffered needlessly.
Right.
We had Jamila Bay here last week, and she talked about the need for the secular community to get better at not just using kind of cold, hard facts and laying out a didactic lecture, here's why you need to be concerned with separation of church and state, but to tell a story where you actually can relate to a person, you give them a face to put the problem on, and then connects much better. So I'm going to attempt to do that this past week, and I wanted to go back through your book before you came here, before I met you. And so I brought it with me when we were running around doing stuff. And at the soccer game, I was kind of just quietly reading this where nobody could see what it was. And one of the dads next to me looked over, hey, what are you reading? And at first I kind of gave a sheepish answer because I didn't really want to proselytize, and I'm reading about secular America and the need for us to stand up, and atheism and a whole bunch of things that he was just there for the soccer game. But he asked a couple times, so then I meekly showed him this very understated cover of yours,
right.
with the attack of the Theocrats. And then we had a great hour-long conversation. And it was very interesting because I didn't know much about him. We've known each other for over a year. We played Frisbee down there, but we never really had a serious talk.
Yeah.
And he was much more open to the whole importance of secularism and very much a free thinker. And during our conversation, one of the questions that he asked was, do I really think that you can legislate morality? And in the back of my mind, I remembered hearing that somewhere, and I gave the kind of a stock answer, well, you can certainly set laws in place that affect people's behavior. But then as I was going back through your book on page 38, you talk very directly about that we are legislating morality all the time. That's exactly what legislation is about. So maybe you can talk about that. Where does legislation and morality come together?
Well, you're illustrating actually one of the centerpiece goals of my book is that it's a toolkit for the reader. So that, some people, if they want to talk about, for example, whether or not to believe in God, I believe there's this obscure professor named Richard Dawkins that people might want to turn to his book for that. My book is about something entirely different. It's saying, here are these specific examples where many people, including sometimes sadly children, are harmed by religious bias in American law, so that you can talk to. I talk about, to sort of simplify it, but the Joe Six-Pack and the soccer mom, that you get a chance to chat with them, and then rather than say, here I'm right, you're wrong on this broad philosophical issue, here's this case where this child died. Isn't that wrong? Can we work together to improve the situation? Whether they are religious or not religious, it gives you something concrete to discuss. And it is a moral issue, which you raise an important point. For me, I always said this when I was in elective office, that's all we legislate is morality. If you have an environmental law, why are they passing that? Because society has made a decision overall through our elected representatives to say this level of pollution is something we're not going to accept. It all comes out in details, but you're still making a moral decision. Unfortunately, I feel like the word morality has been hijacked, stolen, by the religious right, where they say morality, and unfortunately I'd say the general population now, unlike 30 years ago, when you use the word morality, it generally has to do with your naughty bits. It has to do with sex talk, which I believe that morality plays in that area as well as it does in every other area, but they've tried to limit it to that and to their sort of prescriptive view of what they think is right. Whereas in my book I say real morality is caring and compassion for your fellow human being. And I think that's important for us, for the message of secularism. The key point of my book is this is a moral call. This is a call to justice with specific steps. It's not that we disengage from morality. We embrace it. We celebrate it.
And what are some of the specific steps that we can take?
Right. Well, and I'm working, sort of taking the plan that's in my book, and honored to be at the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, where I'm Director of Strategy and Policy, to work on strategies and policies to move us forward. So I mentioned before about really building the movement. That is number one. If I were to say the biggest thing is build the numbers of dollars and people that are invested in this cause. So step one, I think of that as sort of your day-to-day, person-to-person step, where say, take the examples in this book. Don't be shy at the soccer game with your kids. I mean, if anybody asks to say, yeah, look at this horrible story, and tell people that way. But that gets us a certain distance. To go further, and the Richard Dawkins Foundation is helping to sponsor this, is we want to see statewide and in other nations, national conventions, so in every state and in every country abroad, so that you really have an active organization. If you think of the civil liberties unions, there's back in there was Maine Civil Liberties Union, there's Nevada Civil Liberties Union. We want to have that secularism is part of the civic life, if you will. And so we at the Dawkins Foundation, I'll go do grassroots trainings, talk about my lobbying experience, talk about my elective office experience, but more important, maybe sort of talk about, when I was in politics, just how do we get an organization together that really is statewide and inclusive for secularism. So that's one goal. Another critical goal is I'm working with folks, and I hope you, to have a movement in Iowa for 2016. You know that Iowa is the most media per capita of any place in the world leading up to the presidential caucus. Rather small population state, huge amounts of reporters looking for a story. We're going to give them one, and it's going to be keep religion out of government. And we're going to bring in people with the sponsorship of the Dawkins Foundation, but people organizing locally to say, we're going to come from Florida, from California, from Washington State, from New Hampshire, and we're going to meet there in Iowa, and we are going to change the whole tone of American politics. So that's 2 steps, and there's more.
Is that underway, the Iowa?
Yes, in fact,
approach?
I will be meeting in May in Iowa with folks on the ground who are local sponsors. But the key, as important as the local Iowa people are, and they are very important to this, of course, but that we're talking, I've given talks around the country. I already gave a talk in Florida, and I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide up the calendar year leading up to the caucus, and we are going to get people there, and it's going to be a national effort, and really something dramatic.
And by the way, you are, as you mentioned earlier, I'm unaware of anybody else in your position where you're an actual former legislator who is now active in the atheist movement.
As far as I'm aware, in all secular skeptic movements, though we want to have more. And I want to see more people who are involved in efforts like working as a staffer for an elected official. Not because that's the be-all and end-all or the only thing, but we need that engagement with the civic process. And that, to me, is really building upon the things that Richard Dawkins and others have done, and so that we are finally representing our true percentages in American society.
Exactly. Be visible, be vocal is what I tell people when I'm asked. If nothing else, be visible, be vocal, be unashamed.
Yeah.
Be out there normalizing us all the time.
And I would also add that we're the good guys. I have no hesitancy. I am a happy proselytizer, if you will, and I would not begrudge it to anyone else. That is to say, if somebody said, you Lutheran minister can't go out and speak for their cause, I say, well, of course they can, and they should. Good for them if that's what they believe. But I'm not going to be made afraid to speak for what I believe in. And the focus of that for me is this civil rights cause, this human rights cause, which I think is the biggest in the next generation that we're leading. And I'm thinking Iowa can be a big part of that.
But one of the things I found really helpful is in your book where you give so many examples, it gives sort of a non-threatening way where you don't have to go after somebody's religion. You can, hey, here's this child care case, or here, maybe you can talk about Title IX for girls, the hidden part, but you can bring up some things that a lot of people would probably be on the secularist, humanist side if they only knew about the problem.
Exactly.
Maybe you can talk about Title IX.
You mentioned about the Title IX, and that is a key tactic for me. So I'll illustrate Title IX, then I'll sort of bring it to the broader picture. Title IX, which many of your viewers may be aware of, passed in 1972. It was not particularly controversial on the academic side. It said women and girls should be treated equally in education. The controversial stuff, especially for sports fans, as people may recall, was whether or not women's and girls' athletics got the same amount of money and support as did the guys. So that part was controversial. But even in '72, the equity in education and academics was not that controversial. But what is overlooked and little known is there's a provision that says if it violates the tenets of your religion, then your educational institution could be exempt from treating females equitably, which I think is horrific. And a lot of people aren't even aware that this is part of the law. And I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of girls and boys, which I think is just as bad for the boys, that in 2013 could theoretically be taught because of the religious tenets of their religious school that girls shall be subordinate. And indeed, in fundamentalist education, accelerated Christian education, and others, they talk about the so-called traditional role of women in teaching girls this, which I think is an absolute violation of their human rights. And like you say, I think the average person hearing that, there'd be some who disagree, but the average person I think would say, geez, that's wrong, I didn't know that.
Or the average parent, are you going to send your kid to a school if they're a girl and they're allowed to be discriminated against because that's what God wanted? And so much the gay legislation where bullying is okay if you're against gays and the kid happens to be gay.
Exactly.
I confess, I didn't know that either about the religious exemption.
That's what chapter 3 of my book is for, is kind of to give you specific examples where you can say, did you know about this? Did you know about this? How about this? And so that's why the 10-point vision of a secular America is reflecting 10 areas of injustice in American law. So you can, really give people a catalog. But even more important than that, with the 10-point vision, is we turn it to the positive. And so we're saying, we're going to change these things. We're working for a human rights movement. And that's what I think can really spread both in the statewide free thought organizations, but also, like I said, just came back from Australia, and they're doing that there, where they have, unfortunately, some similar problems to us in terms of church-state issues. And that can be a rallying cry to move people forward.
So beyond just the 10 points you talk about, you offer a plan of action. a way to approach this from the legislative side, or
Mostly,
other ways?
yes, from the legislative side, and I have sections in there that discuss the legislative side, but to me, I really want to see this groundwork built so that when someone goes to an elected official, they can have that confidence based on evidence to say, here's these thousands upon thousands that we're
Numbers.
emailing, and really building that cause. And that's what I want to see. And I think it's kind of a chicken or egg issue, but for me, the way I strategize about it is get the issues that are in the 10-point vision of a secular America out to people so they can talk to their friends and neighbors and say, here's a reason why you should come to our next meeting. We're not just debating, I don't know, the whatever, chapter or gospel of the Bible. We're talking about social change in America today. You ought to come and get involved and get active with us so we can build those numbers. And that in turn can build to a situation where the lobbying can be even more effective.
If there's one thing legislators understand, it is numbers.
Exactly.
And now we've been a little anemic, and a lot of people are still, frightened to be out and to be assertive in their atheism. But I think that's changing. And we were talking about this earlier. I think we're winning. We are making steady progress.
Yeah, I read a chapter in my book about this point. I think we are winning. I don't think it's a guarantee. But I think when you look at the demographics of young people, I think when you look at the injustices and the outrage that the majority of people have about the religious right in America, that all works in our favor. Where I think we still need to do a lot more work is in terms of this kind of grassroots organizing effort. For example, when I talk about these statewide conventions, I'm hoping your viewers will say, yeah, I'll help organize. I'll help bring together all the secular groups. But part of why that's important is I think there's a tendency, I've been Richard Dawkins' opening speaker in 3 book tours, is there's a tendency where people say, we're going to have a great convention because we're going to get Richard Dawkins there. And that's good. It's great if you can. But I would rather say it's New Mexico. We've got a professor from the University of New Mexico speaking who's an expert on some secular issue. Here's a local elected official who said they're going to come speak at our event. So if you have some national or international speaker, great. But that you've built your own farm team, so in New Mexico or whatever state it is, we've got some great speakers ready to go at any time. And I think that's what the conventions can really help with.
We have about 5 minutes left. There's one other thing I want to make sure we touch on before we run out of time. You said earlier in your book that your parents were divorced when you were very young, so you were essentially raised by 2 mothers. One of those had a fundamentalist background, but you didn't. You had a very positive experience. She's always been a very strong, good force in your life. And so I was wondering how you approach distinguishing between the evils or the harm caused by organized religion and the good things that are done by people who happen to be religious.
Right. Well, I tell you, one illustration for me of this point is I manage the Richard Dawkins Foundation Facebook page, and I encourage your viewers to go to that page. We're constantly churning out, news and updates on various issues there. But on that page, because of the nature of social media, you'll see people directly who will say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. But then, who are coming from a religious perspective, and then you'll see people who said, I thought that exact same thing. Now I am here and joining in the cause of reason and science. And I was religious a year ago, and I'm 36 years old. So as much as I often hear, even from secular people, that say, oh, you forget about them, there's no way to persuade them. It's just not true. I see them be persuaded all the time. And so I think it's very valuable. And I also think that it show the respect in the sense that I know lots of formerly religious people who are good, decent, honorable people who've come over this side. And I think if you treat currently religious people in that way and say, listen, I like you, but what about this and this and this? Then some of them, not all, but some of them are going to say, yeah, I'm with you, I've moved over. And so I would try to be compassionate to the person and friendly with the person, but not relent, if you will, about the specifics of the problem.
And you also, secularism and atheism, you keep as kind of 2 separate, potentially related things, but you don't have to become an atheist to support separation of church and state.
In my meetings in Iowa in coming weeks, I'm going to meet with the Interfaith Alliance, which is, I'll call it, liberal religious groups, ones who would generally agree with us on separation of church and state. We have a cause in common in terms of separation of church and state. Good. I also happen to think that when we're at the table with folks like this, and in fact in this case where we're leading an effort with folks like this, that it can be very positive, and that some of those people too will say, you guys are making a really good case. I'm going to join you in terms of my worldview as well. But I would not exclude them from the team. In fact, I'm specifically reaching out to them.
You also mentioned that you're working on a film project for Richard Dawkins Foundation.
Right. We're talking about a project that really takes I'd call it a sort of a contrast issue between the victims in the 10 areas of law that I talk about in the 10-point vision of a secular America, and contrast that with the incredible abuses that you see from particularly mega ministers in the United States. And one of the things that we're looking to do, there's a young lawyer named Rachel Payne who's working on a database for us of this, but we need volunteers throughout all of America to help, in fact, potentially internationally to help. Because a lot of times you'll see a scandal like Senator Grassley put his toe in the water about exposing the scandal of mega ministers and the huge amounts of money, but it never really went anywhere. And they also tended to focus on sort of, I'll call them like the Big Ten, the very tip-top wealthiest of the wealthy mega ministers. And those are awful, by the way. It's terrible abuse that they engage in. But I think it might lend itself to a misperception. And that misperception is that, oh, it's just a few people. No. I write in my book, there were fewer than 100 mega churches back in 1970. Fewer than 100. Now there's hundreds and hundreds of these churches, often with 7 and 8 ministers. They all get this parsonage exemption, which grabs money from your pocket and puts it into their fancy estate. And I am no exaggeration here. So,
no, I know you're not, because Kenneth Copeland
yes.
lives on a lake, has property on a lake by where I grew up. Last time I was down there, went to some friend's house, took a boat ride around to his house and took pictures. This amazing house on an air base, which I believe he's leasing from the state of Texas for a pittance.
Yes.
And I sent that, a packet of material, to Senator Grassley. We've got about 45 seconds left.
Yeah.
But
no, that's it. As I say, we're going to Google map the heck out of these guys and show what it is, and that it's not just the top 10. We're talking about people in Anchorage, small towns in Kansas, great wealth. Let's work for compassion and with valid outrage against injustice. That's what I hope my book is about, and that's what we're doing at the Richard Dawkins Foundation.
All right. Well, we're just about out. Thank you so much for joining us. You got some other...
I was just going to say, look for us on Facebook. These shows are available, all our episodes are available on Facebook. In the not too distant future, we're going to be going live and taking call-in, so look for that. In the meantime, if you want to call us and leave some messages that we can maybe address on the air, we'd be happy to do that. So like us on Facebook, look us up on YouTube, and I want to thank Sean Faircloth for being our guest today. It was very enlightening, and I will read your book now. I'm taking this one home with me. So
very
thank
good.
you for being here.
One down.
We're out.